This is 5 Minutes to Curtain. For today's guests, I guess you could say that it all started here. It was theater by the Bay. This is 5 Minutes to Curtain, and today we are with Theater by the Bay's very own Iain Moggach. Welcome to the show, Iain.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, very, very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, your background in acting and producing and all that.
Sure. So I got into acting when I was a kid. I was actually the star of my kindergarten show. And then it was something that was part of my life basically ever since. And then when I went to Canterbury High School for the Arts in Ottawa, I got interested in directing as well as acting. And I had quite a knack for it. Like, it was something that really spoke to me creatively. And I really loved the process of, diving into a script and investigating it and interpreting it. So that seemed to then become more of my artistic calling. But then as I got into university, the prospect of producing also became an interest. So I love marketing. I love designing posters and coming up with how we're going to sell tickets and things like that. So that sort of led me to where I am today, where I do a lot of producing, a lot of directing, a little bit of acting here and there, but all-encompassing in terms of theater. So it's been a huge part of my life ever since I can remember.
That's a lot of hats to wear, isn't it? We were talking about earlier about producers and what's all involved in that chore, but it's been 20 years now, hasn't it, for Theater by the Bay?
22 years for Theater by the Bay,
just over 20 years. And we were talking earlier as well about, I remember the first production that was done. It was down by the lake shore, outdoors, of course, and it's Shakespeare, I believe, right?
That's right, yes.
It's come so far in the last 20 some odd years.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only in terms of the size of the company, but also just in terms of the mandate. Like you mentioned that the company started with Shakespeare and also did kids shows and musicals, and then to sort of, navigate all the way to original work based on stories from the community. It's been quite the journey. And in fact, we actually documented that in a documentary film that we released last year called 20 Years by the Bay.
Yes, awesome. Yeah. So how did you get involved with Theater by the Bay? What's the early beginnings of that and to this day?
Sure. So I was a student at George Brown Theatre School in Toronto, and the artistic director of Theater by the Bay at the time, Alex Doe, came into our business of acting class and said, hey, I'm launching this thing called the Indie Producer Co-op, and it's exclusively for George Brown students. And the Indie Producer Co-op was a 6-week training program on theater producing. So as someone who had a great interest in theater producing, as well as directing and potentially one day even running my own theater company, I knew this program was going to be perfect for me. So I applied, I got accepted, and then, I moved to Barrie for the first time, did that 6-week program there, and I left a big impression, and eventually the company hired me, and I've basically been in various leadership roles ever since. And when Alex stepped down in 2018, I took over as artistic director and have been doing that ever since.
Yeah. Do you recall your very first play that you produced?
Good question. Well, it sort of depends. When I was at Carleton University, I was involved with a theater company there, and so I worked on their board of directors. So I did everything, marketing, like a lot of the producer sort of things. The first thing that I produced independently was probably a production of The Tempest that my George Brown Theatre School friends and I produced in someone's backyard in Toronto. And then that backyard Shakespeare project eventually moved to Barrie, and my wife and I kind of rebooted that here in Barrie because we have a beautiful backyard space. So we carried on that tradition.
Cool. Yeah, neat. So was there a point in your life where the producing and directing kind of took over from the acting side of it? So we're going back a little bit.
Yeah.
But was there a point where you thought, okay, well, acting might not be my thing, but because you wear so many hats, like you said, from doing the posters and producing, and was there a point where you thought, okay, this is really what I want to kind of focus in on?
Probably around the time of the co-op, if not
Okay.
a little bit before.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I love directing since high school. I'd done a little bit of producing before going to George Brown, but it was probably around the co-op where it was like, oh no, I'm good at this, and I can juggle multiple roles at the same time. And so that probably was a pretty big moment, and ultimately ended up being one of the most significant moments of my life.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The theater labs, it's been going for just over 7 years now. Am I
That's
correct?
right, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the theater labs, what it's all about, and how the community can get involved with that?
Absolutely. So the Barrie Theater Lab, as you said, started in 7 years ago, and the idea was to bring all different artists together to work and collaborate on scripts. Because one of the things that certainly I found when I moved to Simcoe County was that there are all these pockets, right? There's like the Aurelia pocket, the Barrie pocket, the Collingwood pocket, and there weren't many spaces where people could just come together every month and share what they've been working on, collaborate, network, talk about projects that they're involved in. And so the lab was meant to sort of help facilitate those kinds of conversations. But more expressly, what it does is that playwrights submit their scripts to us, and then we curate a monthly reading of those scripts. So they're they're meant to be works in progress.
Okay.
Like they're not, never published or anything like that. They're meant to be, getting that initial feedback on something that's in the midst of its development.
I see.
And so in that room, you get, 15 to 20 people every month who are sharing their scripts, reading those scripts out loud, because of course for actors, things like cold reads are really important audition skills to be able to have, but also just people from the community who are interested in theater all get together, talk about what they've read, develop a critical sense of like what works in a script and what doesn't, and the playwrights get all this feedback to then make their scripts better. And actually several of our productions, like Bobby last year and a couple others as well, have went through the lab as part of their process. So,
Cool.
For those people that happened to be in the room that night, they got to hear an early draft of something like Bobby before it was then revealed to the public at large.
Neat, yeah.
So it's been very, very helpful. It's one of the great, prides of my time with Theater by the Bay. Over 170 scripts have been developed, and it's just it's really a gift to the community.
Yeah. Well, actually, that was my next question. Was there anything that's come out of the lab that has gone into production? Did you kind of answer that? Was there any that really stood out that you recall?
Gosh, there's been so many. I mean, one that was I think very emotional was there's a local Indigenous playwright named Zigwin Mixamong who actually wrote a show for us called Minnow Bamadzawin that we produced in 2021. And she submitted this script for the lab called 21 that was her experiences, well, sort of a fictionalized version of her experiences going to the University of Toronto and engaging in, a lot of their colonialist practices there and trying to navigate that space as a 21-year-old Indigenous young woman, and I think the room was quite taken aback by that. But on the flip side, one of the shows that we did through the lab that then ended up being produced was called The 5 Points, and it was a documentary play that we did in 2017, and I'll never forget just the depth of the conversations that emerged from it about, downtown Barrie is a place for people to hang out, and the voices that were, the stories that were being told, referencing other people's experiences and things like that. That also sticks with me on a sort of counterpoint to that.
Yeah. Well, also with the theater being right there too, with the 5 points connected with that as well.
Yeah,
But you can't get much more local in Barrie as far as the 5 points.
Yes, absolutely.
Sure. That's for sure. You guys just finished the Iceman as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So Iceman was an original commission that we paid for, and then ultimately ended up producing by Vern Thiessen, who is a Governor General's award-winning playwright. So this is one of the highest honors a Canadian artist can receive. And he wrote a show for us about the ice harvesting industry on Kempenfeld Bay in the 30s. Yeah. So at the time, this was an enormous industry, like upwards of $2 million in 1930s dollars, moved from that bay every winter. And so it was this enormous industry, and he ended up writing this three-hander thriller about these two brothers that take their boss hostage for ransom, and all about the family dynamics and the politics and the money, and it was sort of this, the message of how the rich stay rich and the poor, there's nothing they can do to kind of climb up the ladder. Obviously, it ended up making it very, very modern and contemporary, even though it was about this real industry and world and mode of existence that happened in Barrie not so long ago.
Yeah, it's crazy because recently I was looking through some of the old Barrie archive stuff, and there was some video there of when the men were taking the ice off, putting it onto the train. It was horses that went around and cutting with these massive saws. And the trains would end up going all the way down to the States with blocks of ice.
I mean, it was such a fascinating world to dive into. Like, as soon as I heard that it was a thing, I was like, well, we have to do a show about this at some point, right? It was, I mean, even just the fact that, what we now see is sort of the walking trail along the bay was once the train tracks that was there because of the ice industry. Like, it's so fascinating and unique. And also, thinking about the winter that we've had, I mean, I don't even think the bay is frozen yet.
No.
Like, it's not even frozen, and yet, a generation ago, like, they would take 100,000 tons of ice potentially every week. Like, it's so fascinating.
Never mind our winter carnivals used to be out on the lake, where there'd be cars and motorcycles, and basically 3/4 of Barrie would be out on that water in February, first week in February.
And I mean, even like you mentioned the photos in the archives, like they were able to build the structures. Like, entire buildings would just sit there because they knew the ice could take the weight of it. Like, so fascinating.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of Barrie and local as well, you've also taken some of the shows on the road as well.
Yes, we have. Yeah, so I think the next evolution of the local stories mandate that we work under is to bring Barrie stories to other communities, right? Because one of my fundamental principles, since I became artistic director, is that Barrie and the Simcoe County area, we want to make sure the work is specific, but in fact, sometimes the more specific we get, the more universal something becomes, right? So in the case of Iceman, like, the ice industry was across North America, right? Like, it was a huge, huge industry. And so, people may not know where like Dunlop Street is, but they would know potentially a little bit about that world and be able to just, fill in the gaps in their brain, just in the same way that, when Shakespeare was writing, not that our work is Shakespeare per se, but, when Shakespeare's writing about Verona, it's like you don't need to know anything about Verona, but you know what he's trying to say. So we've brought our work before to Collingwood through partnership with Theatre Collingwood a couple times, but we've also started to bring, we've taken a few baby steps towards bringing things to Toronto as well. So we've done 2 readings of scripts in Toronto, one of which was most recently A Wedding at Mariposa by local Indigenous playwright Alexandra Gaudet, about a fictional wedding at the Mariposa Cafe in Orillia, and so we're really looking to broaden our reach organizationally.
Yeah, we talked already about the trick question of the day, or the hard one.
Sure.
Who was your favorite producer growing up?
Producer, ooh.
Or director, rather.
Or director, okay,
Let's make it easier.
Sure. I mean, honestly, as we mentioned, there's a lot of crossover sometimes. I mean, in terms of producer directors, I think the work that Chris Abram is doing at Crows right now is extraordinary. As a director, I like to call myself a disciple of Philip Aiken. I actually did a week-long directing workshop with him back in 2017, and I apply a lot of his directing philosophy to my own work. So I absolutely love the work he does. There's so many incredible artists out there. But yeah, Chris Abram and I guess Philip Aiken, purely on the directing side, are the two that come to mind.
Did you take a little bit of both of them? Do you think maybe subconsciously in your own, or is it a lot from experience?
I mean, certainly I hope so. When I was actually at George Brown, I met Chris because he had he was in his production of The Seagull that was happening at Canadian Stage was up, and there was a Q&A with our class after, and I did ask him, what books would he recommend on directing, and he recommended a couple that I do live by and proselytize to others. So so I would like to think that both of them are in the work that I do, but certainly more Philip, because his training with me was very hands-on. It was very intensive, and the notes that I have are basically a full booklet on my desk. So I'd say probably those two.
Yeah. In the upcoming near future, at least we hope, there's talks of, and looks like it's in the projects of, some new theater projects coming up. Can you explain, without going maybe too politically, as to what do you think is really required from the theater groups, from what you know? What can people maybe expect out of the final outcome?
Sure. The idea of a performing arts center in downtown Barrie has been a multi-decade project, and through that process, there have been all sorts of different plans and ideas and features that certain people thought it needed versus others. So it's been this kind of ever-evolving target, I suppose. The most recent one that I've been looking to support and have been part of the conversations of have been something around the 700 seat for the main hall, along with a sort of more intimate theater space, or kind of concert hall-y kind of 350 seat venue as well. But the idea at the heart of it is the idea of an arts hub, a space where people from all different disciplines can rent rooms, can collaborate, can come together. That I think is really important, because just kind of like the lab, we as arts groups, there's more parallels and synergy than there isn't. Just because music and theater need different things, at the end of the day, there's a lot of crossover in terms of what they need, right? And so it's just about finding where those synergies are and what opportunities can come from that. So, I mean, I'm hopeful. This council, as well as the last council, were very adamant that this was something that was important to them. And I think it's just about striking while the iron's hot, while also making sure that there's pressure kept on council to keep their commitment to not only the arts groups that are here, but to the arts groups that might exist in the future, to that next generation, and to the growing number of people in Barrie, A, and B, a sub-point, that enjoy arts and culture and don't want to have to drive to Toronto, don't want to have to potentially, go through a storm to go see something anywhere else, when they could drive down the street to see something that's here, that's locally empowering as well as potentially bringing in other groups from the outside into Barrie, which currently we just don't really have an appropriate modern space to accommodate.
Yeah. Are all the groups, do you think, are their voices being heard with contribution into ideas and thoughts and size and everything else into this project?
That's a great question. I would say yes, for sure, but I think primarily it's because of the Barrie Arts Alliance, which was a group that I helped to found during the pandemic after the Georgian theater lease was canceled, abruptly with no notice. And So what the Alliance ended up doing was it did bring, the leaders of everyone from Simcoe Contemporary Dancers to the Canadian Musicians Co-op to Theatre by the Bay to Talk is Free to Kempenfeld Community Players. It brought all these groups together and said, hey, we need to be a united voice on this issue and make sure that council knows that there's a group that are watching them and making sure that they go through with this, while also making sure that we are also on the same page about what we all need. So that way it isn't one person going to one councillor and saying, I need this one thing, and another group going to it, but rather that we're all coming together, even the Barrie Film Festival as well, we're all coming together and saying, this is what we need. You said you would do this. Here's now make it happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the best chance that we have.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're right. It's a matter of just keep pushing forward. And it is good to hear that there is community input from all aspects of the theater and music community as well, because obviously they're going to be using it. Do you find that perhaps maybe the sizing of some things might be underestimated with the growth of the city?
Well, that's the argument that's being made.
That's another
all
discussion
the time.
all on itself.
Potentially.
I'm sure.
Well, the one of the major points that has been brought up, shall we say, is that not too far from here, there is a theater that is a 650-seater or whatever, that has its own quirks and charms and that kind of thing. But it's not in the district, the region capital, right? And Barrie is a city, as you mentioned, of accelerated growth. And council, if you look at historically, has built too small, right? Whether it's been the Sadlin Arena, which is now, in its own conversations about some sort of massive renovation to get it even just up to code and up to scale for what it needs to be, to the 5 points to this, like there is that tendency to want to scale back to save costs or whatever, only to then put those costs on the next generation to then fix it as much as they can, right?
And you think they'd learn from the arena, using that as an example. I remember my father saying a long time ago, just when it was being built, that why are you building so small with all this progress that's going to be happening in the city? Plus, you'll never be able to hold a Memorial Cup with that amount of seating.
Exactly.
So if you build it, they will come.
Exactly. So that's the case that a lot of groups are making, and there's even some conversation amongst members of the Alliance as to like what is the appropriate fit, because some groups are saying we need as much as 1,200, right, or 900 at least. Meanwhile, there are other groups that say, well, we could never use and ever use a 1,200 seat theater, and that will make the price inaccessible. So we're kind of, it's ebbing and flowing, but I think it'll come down to always what's the budget, what is the final budget, what are the community's needs, and what do we imagine that space to be? Like, for instance, would we take a 600-seat theater if it meant that there were 3 additional halls that could then be rented out for different things, be they recital, be they rehearsals, be they small intimate concerts, be they silent auctions alongside, or whatever it is, right? So, but those are going to be conversations that'll be happening, until the doors open, right? Yeah. So, and even probably as we're talking about the arena, many decades after. So it's an ongoing project. It's one that's obviously very near and dear to my heart, as I know it is for so many people. And we're going to get it. It's just, what are we going to get, and what can the city afford? I'm sure we'll be having this conversation again. Maybe not in front of a camera, but yes, over drinks sometime, for sure. Exactly. Yes, definitely. What's your season with Theatre by the Bay? It's a little different than you have set it up, where it's more geared more towards not so much going on, let's say, in the winter and springtime. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Theatre by the Bay kind of schedules and programs their upcoming shows? Sure. So every season, like every annual general meeting, because Theatre by the Bay is a charity organization, I announce the season of the next year.
Okay.
And typically that means projects that have been in development for at least a year, like projects that we think within a year are going to be stage ready. And so often that means multiple drafts at that point, potentially even workshops, that kind of thing. So it's never a surprise when I announce what the season's going to be to the board. Then we typically do a season announcement at some point during the spring. And then over the last few years, the summer, which has been traditional Theatre by the Bay time, is now held by the Simcoe County Theatre Festival, which is a great project. And then we do 2 shows that sort of spill into the late summer, early fall, and then also now into the fall. And that is different to what we had been doing, but it also just came about because it's like, okay, what makes the most sense for us, right? And what the fall offers in the way that even the spring doesn't is the chance for things like schools to come and see the shows, you know? And because of the work that we do being so local story focused, like, you know, kids can learn about Bobby Rosenfeld. They can learn about the ice industry. They can learn about all these things that spring with things like exams and even the National Theatre School Festival and stuff. It just makes it much more complicated to kind of book around. But also because we're the only arts organization essentially in Simcoe County, arguably in Simcoe County, that does exclusively new work, producing shows in the fall gives us additional development time, right?
Yeah.
It can in some cases give us as much as 5 extra months of work to make sure that the work is of a great quality. And what we've seen through our surveying and through our audience attendance and feedback overall is that seems to really work for people, and the quality of the show has increased. Like the quality of our productions have increased over time, and I think that shift alone is probably a major factor in that success.
Yeah, well, I can see how even from my experience, even a month or 2 can make a huge difference.
Exactly.
In script, you know, make sure you're ready and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, like with Iceman, we were just talking about it, that was about a 2.5-year development process, right? So, and that feels much more different, or very different than if it was just a 2-year. Right, like that additional half is an enormous amount of time for us to work on the show, get the designers up like ready, and just make sure that it's as refined as possible. So in the case of Iceman, we were able to do a whole other workshop in the spring. You know, we were able to give Vern, the playwright, all that additional time and support. It gave our designers I think about 5 months to dream and envision and talk to me about what their designs were and how we can make it work, and then lean on our set builders and stuff and give them time, give the set painters time. Like it just gives us more time. And as you said, time is such an important asset, you know? Yeah.
How do you guys finally choose a script? Is it a democratic system, or?
The primary way right now is that I ask people to write a show for us, and typically about something specific.
Okay.
So in the case of Vern, because he was so renowned, you know, I basically gave him my big list of all my ideas and said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "Oh, I like this Iceman idea," right? So that's one way to do it, or I'll approach someone specific. So in the case of one of the shows that we are doing this year, I asked the playwright to write a show about this specific topic, because I knew that it would be of interest to them to do that. And that's how that kind of came about. And how they chose to express what that story was, you know, I give them a lot of agency over, but I'm like, this is what I want you to write about. What can you do on that? Or someone will approach me with an idea themselves. And so in the case of Bobby last year, like I'd never heard of Bobby Rosenfeld before until Trudy came into my office and said, "I want to write a show about Bobby Rosenfeld." And she told me about her, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this sounds amazing." So then it's a matter of conversations with myself and also with the artists about, okay, who is this speaking to? right? Who are we trying to actually speak to in our community? And, you know, who are they, perhaps are they different than other audiences before? So doing culturally specific work, doing, you know, work that invites new people into the theater is also something that comes to mind. And then also, of course, balance.
Yeah,
we want something, you got to have a little bit of balance too.
Iain, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We'll catch up again soon, I'm sure.
Sounds good.
Take care.